subpoena to Twitter. Subpoena is not the same thing as a search warrant. Subpoena is just it's issued by lawyers, essentially. They go to the court clerk and say, we want to issue a subpoena, and the clerk says, okay, and stamps it, and then they go out and can get whatever they want. Search warrant, like I said, requires there to be judicial supervision. It requires there to be, you have to have probable cause, there needs to be specific and particular. None of those things are implicated in a subpoena. Ultimately, what happened was when they went to go get the tweets from Twitter, Twitter said, well, first Harris said, well, no, you needed to get a search warrant to get that stuff. So this got litigated, and ultimately what the court found was that Twitter users have no standing to challenge the subpoena. What does that mean? What that means is that the court in New York City found that if you use Twitter, you lose your right to essentially control how that data is disseminated. That it no longer belongs to you, to the point that you don't even have a legal right to challenge someone trying to get information that you generated and that you put online. This is a very scary proposition. Because, like I said, it takes all of that data that you generate, all that data that you put in the cloud, that you put in social media, and it basically allows the government free reign to have it. Well, what's the result? Well, as you could expect, the government request for this data has been skyrocketing. Again, this is from the Google Transparency Report. This is government requests from around the world to hand over user data. And you can see, this is in 6-month increments. You can see the number of requests are going pretty high. So in the reporting period that just ended in June of 2012, Google got 20,000 requests from across the world for user data. And if you look back at 2009, I mean, in 3 years, it's almost doubled. That's those 20,000 requests. That's how many requests came from the United States. Okay? That's 38% of all requests to Google coming from our country. That's the number of user accounts within the United States that law enforcement requested information from Google. And again, they did not necessarily have to get a search warrant for all of the data they wanted. They could have got some of it with a subpoena. And you know how often Google complied with these requests? 90% of the time. Okay? So you think they're standing up for your rights? You think they're fighting for you? 90% of the time, they're giving the government what the government asks for. Okay? So this is a real, tangible thing. I've talked about the Fourth Amendment, but there's also another piece of this that I want to talk about. And maybe, you've heard about it because of the Petraeus thing, but it's called, we call it as geeky lawyers, but it's basically the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. This is the framework of federal law, federal statutory law, that governs the protection of your electronic information. Essentially, what the Congress did in 1986, yes, 1986, is that they recognized there was a problem because of this idea that you lose some privacy rights and information you turn over to third parties. So they decided instead what they would do is they would create a statutory framework. They basically create law that had the effect of providing these privacy protections. And so what it does is it requires, it kind of governs how the government can access records stored by communication providers. So we're talking about Google, Verizon, Yahoo, Hotmail, whatever. Okay. Because it's so old and it's now completely broken and outdated, is that it requires a search warrant. It requires law enforcement to get a search warrant for emails that are stored online for less than 180 days. But after 180 days, the government can get it without a search warrant. Okay. Why 180 days, you may be asking? Well, because in 1986, nobody kept email for 180 days. In 1986, you would log, if you checked email, if you had email, if you're one of the very few people who had email in 1986, you were downloading your email onto a computer and reading it, or you were deleting it after you read it. And because your storage was small, if you had a kilobyte storage, if even that, 10 gigabytes for free, right? And then, you know, and then starts to multiply and click. And at the time, in 1986, when this was enacted, there was no such thing as Facebook or Twitter or any of these other ways by which people communicate online. Because this law governs Facebook and Twitter. So if you've got a Facebook message, like an internal message between you and your buddy, that's been sitting in your Facebook inbox for 180 days, under federal statutory communications privacy law, government can get that without a search warrant. In fact, the government's argued that even if the email is less than 180 days old and would presumably require a warrant, that requirement only applies to unopened email. Okay? Maybe 5 years ago when people checked their email, you know, maybe once a day, okay, there could conceivably be some emails that were unopened. But if you're like me, and you have a smartphone, and you get your email in real time, and you're reading it in real time, you probably don't have a lot of unopened email. Or the unopened email is all the spam you don't want to read anyway, right? But the actual important messages that contain your actual conversations with your friends and family and loved ones, etc., you actually read those, and most people read them right when they get it. Well, the second you read it, the government argues they don't have to get a search warrant yet. Okay? And they can get everything else without it. So they can get routing information, like the headers of an email, so they can get who you're communicating with, who's communicating with you, which IP address you're using to send a particular email, which IP address is receiving that email. And with the way technology works today, all of that can be pieced together to create a vivid map of where you're sending messages from, how frequently you're sending them from, your patterns of where you send them from. Or do you constantly do you always do your emailing when you're in your house, in your bedroom at night? If you're like me and you just respond to email the second you get it, then, you know, if anybody got my IP addresses, they would have a nice little trail of every place I've been. Because I get email on my phone, I check it all the time, I respond all the time. This is the problem. We're losing that right to privacy. I put this little chart up to show you just how kind of crazy the law is with respect to email. You can see with email, this is just one example. With email, it depends on where you store the email and how long you've kept it. That's going to change what type of access, or what type of judicial authorization the government's going to need to access it. So if you have a draft email saved in a local folder, like if you use Outlook, and you start writing an email, and then you save it in a draft in Outlook, okay, that's a search warrant. That's easy. But if you write a draft email and you save it in your ISP, so if you open up Gmail through the web, and you start writing an email and you save it as a draft, the government argues they don't need a search warrant for that. Okay? The easiest one is, you have the most protection in sent email while in transit, meaning if the government wants to monitor your email as it's actually coming into your inbox in real time, they have to get a wiretap order. Ever seen The Wire? You know how they're sitting around listening to the phone calls? That's what they have to get. They have to get the judicial authorization for that. But email travels so quickly these days. How long does it take for an email to travel? It doesn't take very long. And once it gets to the inbox, then they don't have to use wiretap information. And then you can see here, I've kind of talked about this, the 180 days, and the distinction between open email and unopened email. I mean, look, it's a mess. This is what happens when Congress writes a law that's probably older than everyone in this room, me accepted, and hasn't updated it since 1986. And now you see the problem. And for a long time, I would give talks like this, and people would say, whatever. That's all nice and dandy. But like I said, I got very lucky because a gigantic national scandal involving the director of CIA now has brought all of this to the forefront. And now we've seen articles in the New York Times and in LA Times talking about our online privacy and electronic privacy laws don't work. If it allows the FBI, in a case that does not involve a criminal charge, to get access to tons and tons and tons of emails, and much of it they may have gotten without a search warrant. Okay. So I've kind of done the doom and gloom. Okay, I've really hopefully painted a very scary picture of how the law is terrible right now. And so now it's that this is my job to empower you all to not feel doom and gloom, and hopefully you can realize that there are things you can do. And the first thing I think you have to do, and particularly those of you, if you're all, in the computer science realm, you're going to probably be much more tech savvy than like my parents, for example. But you need give up their privacy rights for the sake of the conveniences of technology, all the